Another reason Lynn was attracted to Peter was that he was so at home in his body. When I looked at the two of them, I was often reminded of the words of one of my professors. If you want to know what kind of person a client is married to, imagine his or her opposite. Lynn would sit with her arms and legs crossed, while Peter would sprawl in his chair with complete abandon. Sometimes he would kick off his shoes and sit cross-legged. Other times he would swing one leg up and hook it across the arm of the chair. Lynn wore tailored clothes, buttoned to the top button, or a business suit with a silk scarf knotted securely around her neck. Peter wore loose-fitting corduroy pants, shirts open at the neck, and loafers without socks. Now we have some clues to why Lynn was attracted to Peter. Why was Peter attracted to Lynn? The fact that she had an emotional nature was one of the reasons. Although his parents had accepted Peter's body, they had rejected his feelings. When he was with Lynn, he felt more connected to his repressed emotions. She helped him regain contact with his lost self. In addition, she had numerous character traits that reminded him of his parents. Her sense of humor reminded him of his mother, and her dependent, self-effacing manner reminded him of his father. Because Lynn matched Peter's imago, and Peter matched Lynn's, and because they had numerous complementary traits, they had fallen in love. The question that I'm frequently asked when I talk about the unconscious factors in mate selection is this: how can people tell so much about each other so quickly? While certain characteristics may be right on the surface, Peter's sexuality, for example, or Lynn's sense of humor, others are not so apparent. The reason that we are such instant judges of character is that we rely on what Freud called unconscious perception. We intuitively pick up much more about people than we are aware of. When we meet strangers, we instantly register the way they move, the way they seek or avoid eye contact, the clothes they wear, their characteristic expressions, the way they fix their hair, the ease with which they laugh or smile, their ability to listen, the speed at which they talk, the amount of time it takes them to respond to a question. We record all of these characteristics, and 100 more, in a matter of minutes. Just by looking at people, we can absorb vast amounts of information. When I walk to work each morning, I automatically appraise the people on the crowded Manhattan sidewalks. My judgment is instantaneous. This person is someone I wish I knew. That person is someone I have no interest in. I find myself attracted or repulsed with only a superficial glance. When I walk into a party, one glance around the room will often single out the people that I want to meet. Other people report similar experiences. A truck driver told me that he could tell whether or not he wanted to pick up a particular hitchhiker, even though he was cruising at 65 miles an hour. And I'm rarely wrong, he said. Our powers of observation are especially acute when we are looking for a mate, because we are searching for someone to satisfy our fundamental unconscious drives. We subject everyone to the same intense scrutiny. Is this someone who will nurture me and help me recover my lost self? When we meet someone who appears to meet these needs, the old brain registers instant interest. In all subsequent encounters, the unconscious mind is fully alert, searching for clues that this might indeed be the perfect mate. If later experiences confirm the imago match, our interest climbs even further. On the other hand, if later experiences show the match to be superficial, our interest plummets, and we look for a way to end or reduce the importance of the relationship. Unbeknown to them, this was the psychological process that Lynn and Peter were engaged in when they met that day at a friend's house. Because Peter seemed to match Lynn's imago, she went out of her way to see him again. Because Lynn, in turn, was a reasonably good imago match for Peter, her interest was returned. This was not just another case of unrequited love. After a few weeks, Peter and Lynn had accumulated enough data about each other to realize that they were in love. Not everyone finds a mate who conforms so closely to the imago. Sometimes only one or two key character traits match up, and the initial attraction is likely to be mild. Such a relationship is often less passionate and less troubled than those characterized by a closer match. The reason it is less passionate is that the old brain is still looking for the ideal, gratifying object. And the reason it tends to be less troubled is that there isn't the repetition of so many childhood struggles. When couples with weak imago matches terminate their relationships, it's often because they feel little interest in each other, not because they are in great pain. There wasn't all that much going on, they say. Or, I just felt restless. I knew that there was something better out there. At this point in our discussion of love relationships, we have a more complete understanding of the mystery of romantic attraction. To the biological theory and the exchange theory and the persona theory discussed in Chapter 1, we have added the idea of the unconscious search for a person who matches our imago. Our motivation for seeking an imago match is our urgent desire to heal childhood wounds. We also have new insight into marital conflict. If the primary reason we select our mates is that they resemble our caretakers, it is inevitable that they are going to re-injure some very sensitive wounds. But before we sink into this quagmire of pain and confusion called the power struggle, I would like to focus on the ecstasy of romantic love. Those first few months or years of a relationship when we are filled with the delicious expectation of wish fulfillment. Chapter 4. Romantic Love. From Ovid. We too form a multitude. I know from my own experience with Helen, and from listening to others, that lovers believe their time together is special and separate from the experiences of all the other people of the world. It is a time they savor and return to in their memories again and again. When I ask couples to describe these idyllic first days to me, they describe a world transformed. People seem friendlier, colors were brighter, food tasted better. Everything around them shimmered with a pristine newness, just as it did when they were young. But the biggest change was in the way they felt about themselves. Suddenly they had more energy and a healthier outlook on life. They felt wittier, more playful, more optimistic. When they looked in the mirror, they had a new fondness for the face that looked back at them. Maybe they were worthy of their lover's affection after all. Some people felt so good about themselves that for a time they were even able to give up their substitute forms of gratification. They no longer needed to indulge themselves with sweets or drugs or alcohol, or tranquilize themselves with TV, or spice up their lives with recreational sex. Working overtime lost its appeal, and scrabbling after money and power seemed rather pointless. Life had meaning and substance, and it was standing right there beside them. At the peak of their love relationships, these intense good feelings radiated outward, and people felt more loving and accepting of everyone. Some were even blessed with a heightened spiritual awareness, a feeling of inner unity, and a sense of being connected with nature that they hadn't experienced since childhood. For a brief time, they saw the world not through the fractured lens of their split-off state, but through the smooth, polished lens of their original nature. Lynn and Peter, the couple I introduced to you at the end of the previous chapter, told me that when they were very much in love, they spent a day sightseeing in New York City. After dinner, they impulsively took the elevator to the top of the Empire State Building so they could see the sunset from the observation deck. They held hands and looked down on the thousands of people milling below them with a feeling of compassion. How tragic that these people were not sharing their moment of ecstasy. This timeless sentiment is beautifully expressed in a letter from Sophia Peabody to Nathaniel Hawthorne, dated December 31st, 1839. Best beloved, what a year has this been to us. My definition of beauty is that it is love, and therefore includes both truth and good. But those only who love as we do can feel the significance and force of this. My ideas will not flow in these crooked strokes. God be with you. I am very well, and have walked far in Danvers this cold morning. I am full of the glory of the day. God bless you this night of the old year. It has proved the year of our nativity. Has not the old earth passed away from us? Are not all things new? Your Sophie. The chemistry of love. What causes the rush of good feeling that we call romantic love? Psychopharmacologists have learned that lovers are literally high on drugs, natural hormones and chemicals that flood their bodies with a sense of well-being. During the attraction phase of a relationship, the brain releases dopamine and norepinephrine, two of the body's many neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters help contribute to a rosy outlook on life, a rapid pulse, increased energy, and a sense of heightened perception. During this phase, when lovers want to be together every moment of the day, the brain increases its production of endorphins and enkephalins, natural narcotics, enhancing a person's sense of security and comfort. Dr. Michael R. Leibowitz, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at Columbia University, takes this idea one step further and suggests that the mystical experience of oneness that lovers undergo may be caused by an increase in the production of the neurotransmitter serotonin. But as intriguing as it is to look at love from a pharmacological point of view, scientists can't explain what causes the release of these potent chemicals or what causes them to diminish. All they can do is document the fact that romantic love is an intense physical experience with measurable biological components. To gain additional insight, we need to return to the field of psychology and to the view that romantic love is a creation of the unconscious mind. The universal language of love. In the previous chapter, I offered an explanation of romantic love. The reason we have such good feelings at the beginning of a relationship, I asserted, is that a part of the brain believes that finally we have been given a chance to be nurtured and to regain our original wholeness. If we look in the right places, we can find plenty of evidence that this is indeed what happens. One place to look is in the universal language of lovers. By listening to popular songs, reading love poems, plays, and novels, and listening to hundreds of couples describe their relationships, I have come to the conclusion that all the words exchanged between lovers since time began can be reduced to 4 basic sentences. The rest is elaboration. And these 4 sentences offer a rare glimpse into the unconscious realm of romantic love. The first of these sentences occurs early in a relationship, maybe during the first or second encounter, and it goes something like this. I know we've just met, but somehow I feel as though I already know you. This isn't just a line lovers hand each other. For some unaccountable reason, they feel at ease with each other. They feel a comfortable resonance, almost as if they had known each other for years. I call this the phenomenon of recognition. Somewhat later, lovers get around to the second significant exchange of information. This is peculiar, they say to each other. But even though we've only been seeing each other for a short time, I can't remember when I didn't know you. Even though they met only a few days or weeks ago, it seems as though they've always been together. The relationship has no temporal boundaries. I call this the phenomenon of timelessness. When a relationship has had time to ripen, lovers look in each other's eyes and proclaim the third meaningful sentence. When I'm with you, I no longer feel alone. I feel whole, complete. One of my clients, Patrick, expressed the feeling in these words. Before I knew Diane, I felt as though I had been spending all of my life wandering around in a big house with empty rooms. When we met, it was like opening a door and finding someone home. Being together seemed to put an end to his relentless search for completion. He felt fulfilled, filled up. I call this the phenomenon of reunification. Finally, at some point, lovers utter a fourth and final declaration of love. They tell each other, I love you so much, I can't live without you. They have become so involved with each other that they can't imagine a separate existence. I call this the phenomenon of necessity. Whether lovers actually say words like these, or merely experience the feelings behind them, they underscore what I have been saying so far about romantic love and the nature of the unconscious. The first sentence, in which lovers report an eerie sense of recognition, loses some of its mystery when we recall that the reason people choose their lovers is that the lovers resemble their caretakers. No wonder they have a sense of déjà vu, a feeling of familiarity. On an unconscious level, they feel connected once again with their caretakers. Only this time, they believe their deepest, most fundamental, most infantile yearnings are going to be satisfied. Someone is going to take care of them. They are no longer going to be alone. The second statement, I can't remember when I didn't know you, is a testimony to the fact that romantic love is an old brain phenomenon. When people fall in love, their old brain fuses the image of their partners with the image of their caretakers, and they enter the realm of the eternal now. To the unconscious, being in an intimate love relationship is very much like being an infant in the arms of your mother. There is the same illusion of safety and security, the same total absorption. In fact, if we could observe a pair of lovers at this critical juncture of their relationship, we would make an interesting observation. The two of them are taking part in an instinctual bonding process that mimics the way mothers bond with their newborn infants. They coo, prattle, and call each other diminutive names that they would be embarrassed to repeat in public. They stroke, pet, and delight in every square inch of each other's bodies. What a cute little navel. Such soft skin. Just the way a mother adores her baby. Meanwhile, they add to the illusion that they are each other's surrogate parents by saying, "I'm going to love you the way nobody ever has," which the unconscious mind interprets to mean more than mommy and daddy. Needless to say, the old brain revels in all of this delightfully regressive behavior. The lovers believe they are going to be healed, not by hard work or painful self-realization, but by the simple act of merging with someone the old brain has confused with their caretakers. What about the third sentence? That feeling of wholeness and oneness that envelops lovers. When lovers tell each other, "When I'm with you, I feel whole, complete," they are acknowledging that they have unwittingly chosen someone who manifests the very parts of their being that were cut off in childhood. They have rediscovered their lost self. A person who grew up repressing his or her feelings will choose someone who is unusually expressive. A person who is not allowed to be at ease with his or her sexuality will choose someone who is sensual and free. When people with complementary traits fall in love, they feel as if they've suddenly been released from repression. Like Plato's truncated androgynous beings, each of them had been half a person. Now they are whole. And what about that last sentence? The feeling that lovers have that they will die if they part. What can this tell us about the nature of romantic love? First, it documents the fact that lovers unknowingly transfer responsibility for their very survival from their parents to their partners. This same marvelous being who has awakened Eros is now going to protect them from Thanatos, the ever-present fear of death. By attending to their unmet childhood needs, their partners are going to become allies in their struggle for survival. On a deeper level, this sentence reveals the fear that if lovers were to part, they would lose their rediscovered sense of wholeness. They would once again be fractured, half-whole creatures, separated from the fullness of existence. Loneliness and anxiety would well up inside them, and they would no longer feel connected to the world around them. Ultimately, to lose each other would be to lose their new sense of self. A brief interlude. For a while, however, these fears are held at bay, and to the lovers it seems as though romantic love is actually going to heal them and make them whole. Companionship alone is a soothing balm. Because they are spending so much time together, they no longer feel lonely or isolated. And as their level of trust increases, they deepen their level of intimacy. They may even talk about some of the pain and sorrow of their childhood. And if they do, they are rewarded for their openness by their lover's heartfelt sympathy. "Oh, I feel so sad that you had to go through that. How awful that you had to suffer so much." They feel as if no one, not even their own parents, has cared so deeply about their inner world. As they share these intimacies, they may even experience moments of true empathic communion and become absorbed in each other's world. During these rare moments, they aren't judging each other or interpreting what their lovers are saying or even comparing their various experiences. They're doing much more. For a short time, they are letting go of their lifelong self-absorption and sharing in the reality of another human being. But romantic love brings more than kind words and empathic moments to heal their wounds. with a sixth sense that is often lamentably lacking in later stages of a relationship. Lovers seem to divine exactly what their partners are lacking. If the partner needs more nurturing, they gladly play the role of mommy or daddy. If the partner wants more freedom, they grant him or her independence. If the partner needs more security, they become protective and reassuring. They shower each other with spontaneous acts of caring that seem to erase their earlier childhood deprivations. Being in love is like suddenly becoming the favored child in an idealized family. Fostering an illusion. For a while, lovers cling to the illusion of romantic love. However, this requires a good deal of unconscious play acting. One bit of make-believe in which virtually all lovers engage is trying to appear more emotionally healthy than they really are. After all, if you don't appear to have many needs of your own, your partner is free to assume that your goal in life is to nurture, not to be nurtured. And this makes you very desirable indeed. One woman, Louise, described to me the effort she went to appear to be the perfect mate for her future husband, Steve. A few weeks after they met, Louise invited Steve over to her house for dinner. "I wanted to display my domestic talent," she said. "He saw me as a career woman, and I wanted him to see I could cook, too." To make her life seem as simple and uncomplicated as possible, she arranged to have her 11-year-old son from a previous marriage stay the night with a friend. No reason to reveal all of life's complexities at this stage of the game. Then she thoroughly cleaned the house, planned the menu around the only two things she could cook really well, quiche and Roquefort salad, and arranged fresh flowers in all the rooms. When Steve walked into the house, dinner was ready, her makeup was fresh, and classical music was on the stereo. Steve, in turn, came as his most charming, helpful self. And when dinner was over, he insisted on washing the dishes and fixing the broken porch light. That night, they declared their love for each other. And for several months, they were both able to orchestrate their lives so that they had few, if any, needs of their own. This degree of make-believe is quite common. Most of us go to a lot of trouble in the early stages of a relationship to appear to be ideal mates. In some cases, however, the deception is more extreme. One of my clients, a woman I'll call Jessica, had a history of becoming involved with unreliable men. She had 2 failed marriages and a string of painful relationships. The relationship that finally convinced Jessica she needed therapy was with Brad, a man who at first seemed totally devoted to her. Once he had gained her trust, she told him about all her previous difficulties with men. Brad was sympathetic and assured her that he would never leave her. "If anyone leaves, it will be you," he said. "I will always be here." He seemed for all the world like a stable, trustworthy mate. The two of them were together constantly for about 6 months, and Jessica began to relax into the security of the relationship. Then one day, she came home from work to find a note from Brad pinned to the door. In the note, he explained that he had been offered a higher-paying job in another town and couldn't turn it down. He had wanted to tell her about it in person, but he had been afraid she'd be too upset. He hoped that she would understand. When Jessica recovered from shock, she called Brad's best friend and demanded that he tell her what he knew. As she listened to him talk, a shockingly different portrait of Brad began to emerge. Apparently, he never stayed in one place very long. In the previous 15 years, he had moved 6 times and had been married 3 times. All this was news to Jessica. Sensing her need for security, Brad had done his best to appear to be a reliable lover. This is a psychological process known as projective identification. He had unconsciously identified himself with Jessica's vision of the ideal man. My suspicion is that at first, his subterfuge was well-intentioned. He probably didn't begin the relationship with the purpose of gaining her trust and affection and then leaving her. He just couldn't keep up the charade. When Brad left her, Jessica had every reason to fly into a rage. But instead, she fabricated an illusion that he was planning to send for her as soon as he saved up some money. She stayed by the phone for hours in case he called, and waited anxiously for a letter. But she never heard from him again. "And I'm glad I didn't," she told me one day, "because I would have taken him back, no matter what he had done. That's how badly I needed him." Jessica was demonstrating a classic case of denial. She was refusing to believe that Brad was in fact an immature, unreliable man. Her memory of the role he had obligingly played for her was more real to her than the truth of his actual behavior. Denial. To some degree, we all use denial as a coping tool. Whenever life presents us with a difficult or painful situation, we have a tendency to want to ignore reality and create a more palatable fantasy. But there is no time in our lives when our denial mechanism is more fully engaged than in the early stages of our love relationships. John, a man in his 30s who came to me for counseling, was particularly adept at denial. He was a computer programmer who had designed a software program that was so successful, he used it to start his own company. For the first 10 or 15 minutes of each session, he would talk about his company and how well it was doing. Then the conversation would grind to a halt. He would avert his eyes, and he would get around to the real topic of conversation, which was Cheryl, the woman he loved. He was utterly bewitched by her, and would marry her in a second if she would only say yes. But Cheryl kept refusing to make a commitment. When John first met Cheryl, she appeared to be everything he wanted in a woman. She was attractive, intelligent, and delightfully sensual. But a few months into the relationship, he began to be aware of some of her negative traits. When they went out to dinner, for example, he noticed that she always complained about the food or the service, no matter how good it was. He also noticed that she would complain endlessly about her job, but would do nothing to improve her working conditions. To avoid being put off by these negative traits, John engaged in strenuous mental gymnastics. When he went out to dinner with her, he would focus on her discriminating tastes, not on her complaining attitude. When she ranted and raved about her job, he thought about what a trooper she was to put up with such terrible working conditions. "Other people would have quit long ago," he told me with a note of pride. The only thing that really bothered him about Cheryl was her unavailability. She always seemed to be pushing him away. The situation worsened after they had been seeing each other for about 6 months, when Cheryl demanded that he not see her during the week so that she could have a little breathing room. John reluctantly agreed to her terms, even though he knew that one of the reasons she wanted this time off was so that she could date other men. She made it clear to him that he had no choice but to grant her more freedom. As compensation, John started spending time with a woman named Patricia, who was very unlike Cheryl. Devoted, compliant, and patient, she was crazy about him. She'd marry me in a minute, John told me one day, just the way I'd marry Cheryl in a minute. But I don't care that much about Patricia. Even though she's nicer to be around, I never think about her when I'm away from her. It's almost as if she doesn't exist. Sometimes I feel that I'm taking advantage of her, but I don't like to be alone. She fills up the hole. Meanwhile, unavailable, critical Cheryl occupied his every waking moment. Whenever I'm not thinking about work, he told me, I'm dreaming about Cheryl. Why was John so immune to Patricia's charms and so willing to overlook Cheryl's faults? It should come as no surprise that John's mother had a critical, distant nature, very much like Cheryl's. A worried look would often come over his mother's face, and she would tune him out. John had no idea what was going on in her mind. Like all children, he had no knowledge of or interest in his mother's subjective state. All he knew was that she was frequently unavailable to him, and this filled him with anxiety. When he recognized that distracted look, he would become angry and strike out at her. She would push him away and send him to his room. If he became very angry at her, she would spank him and not talk to him for hours. Eventually, John learned to suffer in silence. He has a vivid memory of the day he learned to adopt a stoical attitude. His mother had yelled at him and spanked him with a hairbrush. He doesn't remember what had made her so angry. All he remembers is that he felt his punishment was unjustified, and he ran sobbing to his room. When he got to his room, he went into his closet and closed the door. The closet had a mirror on the inside of the door, and he remembers turning on the light and staring at his tear-streaked face. Nobody cares that I'm in here crying, he told himself. What good is it to cry? After a while, he stopped crying and wiped away his tears. The remarkable thing is that he never cried again. That very day, he began to cover over his sadness and his anger with an unchanging mask. John's childhood experiences help explain his mysterious attraction to Cheryl. When Cheryl ignored his advances by going out with other men or by asking him not to call her for a few days, he was filled with the same primitive yearning for closeness that he had experienced with his mother. In fact, there was so much in common between the two women that on an unconscious level, he could not distinguish between them. Cheryl's coldness activated in him the same intense longing he had felt for his mother. As far as his old brain was concerned, Cheryl was his mother, and his efforts to win her favor were a grown-up version of the crying and yelling he had done as a child to attract his mother's attention. The psychological term for this case of mistaken identity is transference, taking the attributes of one person and overlaying them on another. It is especially easy for people to transfer their feelings about their parents onto their partners because through a process of unconscious selection, they have chosen partners who resemble their caretakers. All they have to do is exaggerate the similarities between them and diminish the differences. John had other reasons to be drawn to Cheryl besides her resemblance to his mother. Another source of his attraction was that she had an artistic flair. Since he was a rather dull businessman, his own words, her refined sense of aesthetics opened up whole new dimensions to him. We'll be driving in the car, and I'll have my head full of business plans, he told me. And Cheryl will draw my attention to an interesting building or a beautiful tree, and it will suddenly materialize before my eyes. I wouldn't have seen it at all if she hadn't called it to my attention. It's almost as if she creates it. When I'm alone, My world seems gray and two-dimensional. Something else about Cheryl that attracted him, though he would have vehemently denied it, was the fact that she had a caustic, critical nature. This dark side of her personality appealed to him for two reasons. First, as we've already discussed, it reminded him of his mother, who was an angry, emotional person. Second, and perhaps more important, Cheryl's bad temper helped him get in touch with his own denied emotions. Even though he had just as much anger as Cheryl, he had learned to mask his hostility behind a compliant, accepting manner. In childhood, this had been a useful adaptation because it protected him from his mother's temper. But now that he was an adult, this repression left him half a person, without being able to feel and express strong emotions. He felt empty inside. He discovered that when he was with Cheryl, he experienced a much-needed emotional catharsis. He didn't have to be angry himself. That would have aroused his superego, the parent cop inside his head, which carried on his mother's prohibitions. Instead, he could have the illusion of being a whole person once again, just by associating himself with her. Home movies. Projection is the term that describes the way John took a hidden part of himself, his anger, and attributed it to his lover. He projected his repressed anger onto Cheryl's visible anger. Like John, we project whenever we take a part of the disowned self or the lost self and send it out like a picture onto another person. We project all the time, not just in our primary love relationships. I remember one time in Dallas when I was sharing a suite with a psychiatrist whose first name was James. We had an extra room, and we were looking for another person to share the rent. James had a friend who had finished medical school and was going into private practice, so he suggested that we consider him for a suite mate. Since that sounded fine to me, James agreed to invite his friend over so I could meet him. A few days later, I opened my office door and happened to see a man walking down the hall. He was walking away from me, so all I saw was his back. But there was something about his walk that I found extremely irritating. He was swinging his hips and his head as if he owned the whole world. He sauntered instead of walked. That has got to be one of the most arrogant men in the world, I told myself. I wonder who that is. He must be a client of James's. I went back into my room and forgot about the incident. A little while later, there was a knock at my door. It was James, and with him was the very man I had seen walking down the hall. "Harville," James said, "this is Robert Jenkins. He's the psychiatrist friend that I told you about who would like to rent the extra room. I thought that you and he might like to go out to lunch together." I took a look at Robert and saw a man with a smiling, pleasant face. He had neatly trimmed hair, a well-groomed salt and pepper beard, horn-rimmed glasses, and large brown eyes. He reached out his hand to me. "Hello, Harville. I've heard so much about you. I hear you're involved in some really interesting things. I'd love to talk with you about it." Such a nice, humble speech, I thought. Could this be the same man that I thought was so arrogant? Robert and I went out to lunch, and we had an interesting conversation. Later that day, I told James that I thought Robert would be an excellent person to share the suite with us. Eventually, Robert became a good friend and a trusted colleague. Although he did have his prideful moments, just like me and everyone else I knew. The negative trait that had seemed so intense when I first saw him was really a part of me. I had taken the part of me that is arrogant, the part of me that does not fit with my image of myself as a sensitive, caring therapist, and thrust it onto Robert. People in love are masters at projection. Some couples go through their whole lives together as if they were strangers sitting in a darkened movie theater, casting flickering images on each other. They don't even turn off their projectors long enough to see who it is that serves as the screen for their home movies. In just such a way, John projected his repressed anger onto Cheryl. Although she was indeed an angry person, he was also seeing in her a part of his own nature, a part of his being that was ego-dystonic, that is, incompatible with his self-image. Romantic love defined. If I were to translate John's love for Cheryl into dry psychological terms, it could be described as a mixture of denial, transference, and projection. John was in love with Cheryl because, 1, he had transferred his feelings about his mother onto her. 2, he had projected his hidden rage onto her visible rage. 3, he was able to deny the pain that she caused him. He thought he was in love with a person, when in fact he was in love with an image projected upon that person. Cheryl was not a real person with needs and desires of her own. She was a resource for the satisfaction of his unconscious childhood longings. He was in love with the idea of wish fulfillment, and, like Narcissus, with a reflected part of himself. Psyche and Eros. The illusory nature of romantic love is beautifully illustrated in the myth of Psyche and Eros, an archetypal legend that was first recorded in the 2nd century A.D. According to this legend, the goddess Aphrodite was jealous of a beautiful young mortal named Psyche and resented the adoration shown her by her countrymen. In a fit of pique, Aphrodite decreed that Psyche be carried to the top of a mountain, where she was to become the bride of a horrible monster. In some versions of the myth, this monster is called Death. Psyche's parents and the local villagers sadly escorted the young virgin up the mountain, chained her to a rock, and left her to her fate. But before Psyche could be claimed by the monster, the west wind took pity on her and gently wafted her down the mountain to a valley that happened to be the home of Aphrodite's son, Eros, the god of love. Psyche and Eros promptly fell in love, but Eros did not want Psyche to know that he was a god, so he kept his true identity concealed by coming to her only in darkness. At first, Psyche agreed to this strange condition and enjoyed her new love, the splendid palace and the beautiful grounds. Then one day, her 2 sisters paid her a visit, and, envious of her good fortune, began to ask prying questions about Eros. When Psyche couldn't answer them, they planted the suspicion in her mind that her lover might be a loathsome serpent intent on devouring her. That night, before Eros came to her, Psyche hid a lamp and a sharp knife under their bed. If her lover turned out to be an evil creature, she was determined to lop off his head. She waited until Eros was sound asleep, then quietly lit the lamp. But as she leaned over to get a closer look at him, a drop of hot oil spilled from the lamp onto his shoulder. Eros quickly awoke, and when he saw the lamp and the knife, flew out the open window, vowing to punish Psyche for discovering the truth by leaving her forever. In anguish, Psyche ran after him, crying out his name. But she couldn't keep up with him, and tripped and fell. Instantly, the heavenly palace and the exquisite countryside vanished, and she was once more chained to a rock on the lonely, craggy mountaintop. As with all fairy tales, there is truth to this legend. Romantic love does indeed thrive on ignorance and fantasy. As long as lovers maintain an idealized, incomplete view of each other, they live in a Garden of Eden. But the myth also contains some fiction. When Psyche lit the lamp and saw Eros clearly for the first time, she discovered that he was a magnificent god with golden wings. When you and I lit our lamps and took our first objective look at our lovers, we discovered that they weren't gods at all. They were imperfect humans, full of warts and blemishes, all those negative traits that we had steadfastly refused to see. Chapter 5. The Power Struggle. From Ovid, I can't live either without you or with you. When does romantic love end and the power struggle begin? As in all attempts to map human behavior, it's impossible to define precisely when these stages occur. But for most couples, there is a noticeable change in the relationship about the time they make a definite commitment to each other. Once they say, "Let's get married," or "Let's get engaged," or "Let's be primary lovers, even though we will still see other people," the pleasing, inviting dance of courtship draws to a close, and lovers begin to want not only the expectation of need fulfillment, the illusion that was responsible for the euphoria of romantic love, but the reality as well. Suddenly, it isn't enough that their partners be affectionate, clever, attractive, and fun-loving. They now have to satisfy a whole hierarchy of expectations, some conscious, but most hidden from their awareness. What are some of these expectations? As soon as they start living together, most people assume that their mates will conform to a very specific but rarely expressed set of behaviors. For example, a man may expect his new bride to do the housework, cook the meals, shop for groceries, wash the clothes, arrange the social events, take on the role of family nurse, and buy everyday household items. In addition to these traditional role expectations, he has a long list of expectations that are peculiar to his own upbringing. On Sundays, for example, he may expect his wife to cook a special breakfast while he reads the Sunday paper, and then join him for a leisurely stroll in the park. This is the way his parents spent their Sundays together, and the day wouldn't feel right unless it echoed these dominant chords. Meanwhile, his wife has an equally long and perhaps conflicting set of expectations. In addition to wanting her husband to be responsible for all the manly chores, such as taking care of the car, paying the bills, figuring the taxes, mowing the lawn, and overseeing minor and major home repairs, she may expect him to help with the cooking, shopping, and laundry as well. Then she too has expectations that reflect her particular upbringing. An ideal Sunday for her may include going to church, going out to a restaurant for brunch, and spending the afternoon visiting relatives. Since neither of them shared expectations before getting married, these could develop into a significant source of tension. But far more important than these conscious or semi-conscious expectations are the unconscious ones people bring to marriage. And the primary one is that their partners, the ones they've winnowed out of long lists of candidates, are going to love them the way their parents never did. Their partners are going to do it all satisfy unmet childhood needs, complement lost self parts, nurture them in a consistent and loving way, and be eternally available to them. These are the same expectations that fueled the excitement of romantic love. But now there is less of a desire to reciprocate. After all, people don't get married to take care of their partner's needs. They get married to further their own psychological and emotional growth. Once a relationship seems secure, a psychological switch is triggered deep in the old brain that activates all the latent infantile wishes. It is as if the wounded child within takes over. Says the child, "I've been good enough long enough to ensure that this person is going to stay around for a while. Let's see the payoff." So the two partners take a big step back from each other and wait for the dividends of togetherness to start rolling in. The change may be abrupt or gradual, but at some point husbands and wives wake up to discover that they've migrated to a colder climate. Now there are fewer back rubs, shorter, more cryptic love notes, less lovemaking. Their partners have stopped looking for excuses to be with them and are spending more time reading, watching television, socializing with friends, or just plain daydreaming. Why have you changed? This bleak rationing of love is partly the result of a disturbing revelation. At some point in their relationships, most people discover that some aspect of their partner's character, a personality trait they once thought highly desirable, is beginning to annoy them. A man finds that his wife's conservative nature, one of the primary reasons he was attracted to her, is now making her seem staid and prudish. A woman discovers that her partner's tendency to be quiet and withdrawn, a trait she once thought was an indication of a spiritual nature, is making her feel lonely and isolated. A man finds his partner's impulsive, outgoing personality, once so refreshing, is now making him feel invaded. What is the explanation for these disturbing reversals? If you will recall, in our desire to be spiritually whole, to be as complete and perfect as God had intended, we chose partners who made up for the parts of our being that were split off in childhood. We each found someone who compensated for our lack of creativity or inability to think or to feel. Through union with our partners, we felt connected to a hidden part of ourselves. At first, this arrangement seemed to work. But as time passed, our partners' complementary traits began to stir up feelings and attributes in us that were still taboo. To see how this drama plays out in real life, let's continue with the story of John, the successful businessman from the previous chapter, who was spending time with Patricia, but desperately wanting to be with Cheryl. John came in for a therapy session one day in an ebullient mood. This time he didn't spend the customary 15 minutes talking about his software business. He plunged right in and told me his good news. Cheryl, in a rare conciliatory gesture, had decided to let him move in with her for a 6-month trial period. This was the answer to his dreams. John's euphoria lasted several months, during which time he decided that he no longer needed therapy. As is true for most of my clients, he had little interest in working on his problems as long as he was feeling happy. But one day he called and asked for an appointment. When he came in, he reported that he and Cheryl were beginning to have difficulties. One of the things he mentioned was that Cheryl's vibrant personality was beginning to grate on him. He could tolerate her emotional excesses, as he now described them, when she directed them at others. For example, when she was berating a clerk or talking excitedly with a girlfriend. But when she beamed her high-voltage emotions at him, he had a fleeting sensation of panic. "I feel like my brain is about to short-circuit," he told me. The reason John was feeling so anxious around Cheryl was that she was beginning to stir his own repressed anger. At first, being around her had given him the comforting illusion that he was in touch with his feelings. But after a time, her free emotional state stimulated his own feelings to such a degree that they threatened to emerge. His superego, the part of his brain that was carrying out his mother's injunction against anger, sent out frantic error messages, warning him to keep his repression intact. John tried to reduce his anxiety by dampening Cheryl's personality. "For God's sake, Cheryl, don't be so emotional. You're behaving like an idiot." And "Calm down, and then talk to me. I can't understand a word that you're saying." The very character trait that had once been so seductive to him was now perceived by his own brain as a threat to his existence. In a similar way, there probably came a time in your relationship when you began to wish that your partner was less sexy, or less fun-loving, or less inventive, somehow less whole, because these qualities called forth repressed qualities in you, and your hidden self was threatening to make an unscheduled reappearance. When it did, it ran headlong into the internal police force that had severed those self parts in the first place, and you were filled with anxiety. This was such an unpleasant experience that you may have tried to repress your partner the same way your parents repressed you. In an effort to protect your existence, you were trying to diminish your partner's reality. Your growing discomfort with your partner's complementary traits was only part of your rapidly brewing storm. Your partner's negative traits, the ones that you had resolutely denied during the romantic phase of your relationship, were also beginning to come into sharp focus. Suddenly, your partner's chronic depression or drinking problem or stinginess or lack of responsibility became evident. This gave you the sickening realization that not only were you not going to get your needs met, but your partner was destined to wound you in the very same way you were wounded in childhood. A glimpse at a painful reality. I made this painful discovery early on in my first marriage. In fact, on the second day of our honeymoon. My new bride and I were spending a week on an island off the shores of South Georgia. We were walking along the beach. I was poking through piles of driftwood, and my wife was down by the water, 200 or 300 feet in front of me, head down, totally absorbed in the task of looking for shells. I happened to glance up and saw her silhouetted against the rising sun. To this day, I can remember exactly what she looked like. She had her back to me. She was wearing black shorts and a red top. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was blowing in the wind. As I gazed at her, I noticed a slight droop to her shoulders. At that instant, I felt a jolt of anxiety. This was immediately followed by the sick, sinking realization that I had married the wrong person. It was a strong feeling. I had to check an impulse to run back to the car and drive away. While I was standing there transfixed, my wife turned to me, waved, and smiled. I felt as though I were awakening from a nightmare. I waved back and rushed up to meet her. It was as if a veil had lifted for a moment and then dropped back down. It took me years to figure out exactly what had happened. The connection was finally made one day while I was in therapy. My therapist was guiding me through a regressive exercise, an exercise designed to take me back to my childhood. And with his help, I was able to picture myself playing on the floor in my mother's kitchen. I was only 1 or 2 years old. I visualized my mother busy at the stove with her back to me. This must have been a typical scene, because I was her 9th child, and she probably spent 4 or 5 hours a day in the kitchen, cooking and cleaning. I could see my mother's back quite clearly. She was standing at the stove wearing a print dress, and she had apron strings tied around her waist. She was tired and depressed, and her shoulders sagged. As an adult, viewing this imaginary scene, I was flooded with the awareness that she didn't have any physical or emotional energy for me. My father had died only a few months before from a head injury, and she was left alone with her grief, very little money, and a house full of children to look after. I felt like an unwanted child. Not that my mother didn't love me. She was an affectionate, caring woman. But she was physically and emotionally worn out. She was so wrapped up in her own worries, she could only look after me mechanically. This was a new discovery for me. Until that point in my therapy, I had attributed my anxiety to the fact that both my parents had died by the time I was 6 years old. But that day, I learned that my feelings of abandonment had started much earlier. In my regressed state, I called to my mother, but she would not answer. I sat in the psychiatrist's office and cried in deep pain. Then I had a second revelation. I suddenly realized what had happened to me that day on my honeymoon. When I had seen my wife so far away from me, so absorbed in herself, and with the same slump to her shoulders, I had had the eerie premonition that my marriage was going to be a repetition of my early days with a depressed mother. The emptiness of the early days of my childhood was going to continue. It had been too much for me to absorb, and I had quickly drawn the curtain. At some point in their love relationships, most people discover that something about their partners awakens strong memories of childhood pain. Sometimes the parallels are obvious. A young woman with abusive parents, for example, may discover a violent streak in her boyfriend. A man with alcoholic parents may wake up to find himself married to an incipient alcoholic or drug addict. A woman who grew up in a contorted Oedipal relationship with her parents may be enraged to discover that her partner is having a secret affair. But the similarities between parents and partners are often subtler. This was the case for Bernard and Catherine, clients of mine who had been married for 28 years. Bernard was a manager of a public utility. Catherine was going back to school to get a degree in counseling. They had 3 children and 1 grandchild. One evening, as they walked into my office for their weekly appointment, they both looked downtrodden and defeated. I guessed right away that they had recently had one of the core scenes, a fight that they had had over and over again throughout the last 20 years of their marriage, in countless subtle variations. Most couples have such a core scene, a fight they have so many times that they know their parts by heart. They told me that the fight had taken place while they were decorating the house for Christmas. Bernard had been characteristically quiet, absorbed in his own thoughts, and Catherine had been issuing orders. All 3 of their children and their spouses were coming to stay for the holidays, and Catherine wanted everything to be perfect. Bernard dutifully performed whatever task was asked of him, and went on pondering his own thoughts. After an hour or so, His silence became deafening to Catherine, and she tried to involve him in a conversation about their children. He volunteered only a few sentences. She became more and more annoyed with him. Finally, she lashed out at him for the way he was hanging the lights on the tree. "Why don't you pay attention to what you're doing? I may as well do it myself." Bernard let her tirade wash over him, then calmly turned and walked out the back door. Catherine went to the kitchen window. As she watched the garage door close behind Bernard, she was filled with two primal emotions: fear and anger. Anger was uppermost. This time she wasn't going to let him retreat. She marched out after him and threw open the garage door. "For God's sake, why don't you help me? You're always locked up in the garage. You never help me when I need you. What's the matter with you?" To a therapist, Catherine's use of global words like always and never would have been a clear indication that she was in a regressive state. Young children have a hard time distinguishing between past and present. Whatever is happening at this moment has always happened in the past and will always happen in the future. But Bernard was not a therapist. He was her beleaguered husband, and he had just escaped from a torrent of criticism in the hopes of finding peace and quiet. His old brain responded to her attack, which in reality was nothing more than an adult version of the infant's cry, with a counterattack. "Maybe I'd help you more if you weren't so bitchy," he retorted. "You're always hounding me. Can't I be alone for 5 minutes?" He seethed with anger, and Catherine burst into tears. As an outsider, I could easily see the step-by-step evolution of their arguments. The trigger for the fights was almost always the fact that Bernard was withdrawn. Trying to get some response from him, Catherine would nag. Bernard would pay no attention to her until he had had all that he could stand. Then he would go to another room to try to find peace and quiet. At that point, Catherine would explode in rage, and Bernard would respond in kind. Finally, Catherine would burst into tears. When they were through recounting this latest episode, I asked Catherine to remember exactly how she had felt working on the holiday preparations with her unresponsive husband. She sat quietly for a moment, struggling to recall her feelings. Then she looked up at me with a puzzled expression and said, "I felt scared. It scared me that he wouldn't talk to me." For the first time, she realized that she was actually afraid of his silences. "What were you afraid of, Catherine?" I asked her. She answered quickly, "I was afraid he was going to hurt me." Bernard looked over at her with wide-open eyes. I said, "Let's check this out with Bernard." "Bernard, were you standing in the kitchen thinking about hurting Catherine?" "Hurting her," he said, his surprise evident. "Hurting her? I have never touched her in my life. I was just thinking my own thoughts. If I remember correctly, I was worrying about the fact that we would need to put a new roof on the house in the spring because of the leak. And I was probably thinking about something at the office." "Really?" asked Catherine. "You weren't mad at me that day?" "No. Sure, I got annoyed when you kept criticizing me, but all I wanted to do was get away. I kept thinking about how nice it would be to be out in the garage, working on my own projects, instead of being nagged at all the time." "Well, the way I see it, you're always angry at me. And eventually you can't hold it in any longer, so you blow up." "I do blow up, but it takes about 2 or 3 hours of your nagging before I do. Anybody would get angry at that. I don't start out being angry at you." This checked out with me. Bernard did not seem to be a violent man. "Catherine," I said to her, "for a moment I want you to close your eyes and think some more about what makes you afraid when Bernard doesn't respond to you." After half a minute, she replied, "I don't know. It's just the silence." She was having a hard time coming up with additional insight. Well, stay with that thought for a moment and try to recall something about silence in your childhood. Close your eyes. The room was quiet. Then Catherine gasped and opened her eyes. "It's my father. I've never seen that before. He used to sink into a deep depression and not talk for weeks. Whenever he was in one of those moods, I knew not to bother him, because if I did one thing wrong, he would hit me. When I saw him start to sink into a depression, I would panic. I knew that I was in for a hard time." Catherine's father and her husband shared an important personality trait. They both were prone to long periods of silence. And this undoubtedly was one of the reasons that Catherine was attracted to Bernard. She had chosen someone who resembled her father so she could resolve her childhood fear of being abused. She didn't marry a talkative, outgoing person. She found someone who had her father's negative traits so she could recreate her childhood and continue her struggle for consistent love and kindness. But Bernard resembled Catherine's father only superficially. He was silent because he was an introvert, not because he was depressed and given to anger. It was Catherine's constant nagging that provoked her husband. I have found this phenomenon in many of my clients. They react to their partners as if they were carbon copies of their parents, even though not all of their traits are the same. In their compelling need to work on unfinished business, they project the missing parental traits onto their partners. Then, by treating their partners as if they actually had these traits, they manage to provoke the desired response. A colleague of mine claims that people either pick imago matches, project them, or provoke them.